Oh, Coffee with the Mighty Miracle Man. I guess we're not having coffee today, at least not yet, but I have a special guest. And would you mind introducing yourself and telling us all a bit about you and what you do?
My name is Cathryn Glenday, and I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I'm a psychotherapist who treats brain injuries, and I'm also a brain injury survivor. And I thought we would talk today. I'm very active in the New Mexico Brain Injury Alliance. And as such, I have a degree in clinical psychology, but I also have a degree in public health, and that makes me a health educator. And I thought I would educate people about other types of brain injuries and things people don't really know about brain injuries, and talk about brain injury rehab.
Well, so let's start with the different types of brain injury. If you can elaborate on that.
Well, most people understand that you can get brain injured from being in a trauma, either from an automobile accident, a sports accident, and that's what most people think about when they think about a brain injury. But
Yes.
you can also have a stroke, which is also called a cardiovascular incident, or a CVA, a cardiovascular incident. And that is when part of your brain dies, either because blood is blocked in the brain or because blood you've hemorrhaged in the brain and you don't have as much blood reaching as before. So that's a vascular injury to the brain. And then the third category is metabolic. And those are people who have potentially been strangled in domestic violence. Some of those are people who've developed, metabolic or liver problems, and their body has built up toxins. So they're literally poisoning their brain. And that can also be from autoimmune illness. It can also be from environmental causes like Stachybotrys mold. And all of these things can impact the functioning of the brain. And now we know much more about the brain, and we don't think of it as discrete parts. So any kind of brain injury can affect any part of the brain.
Yes. That's what I've found as well. Just in experience and working with people with my company.
Mm-hmm. And I'm a brain injury survivor from traumatic abuse. When I was 8, I had a metabolic brain injury that we think was either mold, or I have an underlying autoimmune disease that causes blood clotting. And it could have been a blood clot in my brain blocking that was causing the metabolic injury. Sometimes when people are severe drug addicts or alcoholics, they will build up toxins in their body because their liver and their kidney aren't functioning as well, and they can get metabolic brain injuries. And all of these can affect the different parts of the brain. And there's 3 main divisions of the brain. And one way to think about it is putting your hand in a fist. And this is where your intelligence and your education and your personality exist. That's the that's
Your
the
fingers.
neocortex. Yes. And that's the part of your brain that covers. It's the part of your brain that has all of the bumps and grooves in it. And that's called the neocortex.
On the
And then
gyrate.
And then this part, your thumb, is the midbrain, and that's where emotions and things, the amygdala and the thalamus are in the midbrain. Some of my brain injuries occurred at that location. And then down here on the back is where the cerebellum and the brainstem are. And that way, those are basic functions to stay alive. They're your balance, your proprioception, breathing, your heart beating, your
Yes.
digestion. All of those things happen from in the brainstem. And a
Yes.
brain injury can affect all three or only one part.
Exactly. Thank you for that. Would you elaborate more on the other subjects?
On which other subjects? On the neocortex, that's a part of our brain that's the most recent evolutionary, and that's what makes us human. All mammals have a neocortex, but humans are the most developed. I have seen some beautiful pictures about some models that they've tried to build of all of the connections between the brain cells. The brain cells are called neurons, and they're surrounded by different, depending upon what part of the brain. Some of them have a coating called myelin on it that helps the signals go through faster. It's a type of
Yes.
insulation. You may take an antidepressant. Some of those medications are designed to improve the chemicals in the synapses of the brain. So those are another thing that when your brain communicates, it releases a neurotransmitter and it crosses the space and sends a message to the next cell in line.
Yes. And the synapse, like there's a thing called the synaptic cleft. It's
Mm-hmm.
like on the axon comes and curves around, and then all these things go to the cell body, and chemicals go between.
It's a neuro that say the neurological signal is a combination of chemicals and electricity,
Yes.
and you can also have difficulty with the electrical part of the brain, which happens when sodium and potassium flow in and out of the cell at the same time. So it's
Yes.
very complex, but it breaks down into very simple science.
Yes. That's part of why I love the brain. It's so complex, yet
Yes,
so simple.
it is. It's actually you can break it into pieces very small so that kids or people who are not didn't go that far in school can understand. Just like my model, this is
Yeah.
a model to teach kids about the brain, and we teach kids to regulate their emotions. And one of the things we teach kids is not to flip their lid and be wild emotions, but to think
I
and
love that
anticipate consequences.
analogy.
Well, I believe that's Dr. Daniel Siegel's model. And he is a child psychiatrist, but he's also, there's a new field called interpersonal neurobiology. And everyone interacts with somebody. Every time society interacts or another person interacts with a human being, it impacts their brain. So now all sorts of disciplines, not just medicine and hard
Yes.
science, but every time you have an encounter with another being, whether it's a person or an animal, it impacts your brain. And that's what interpersonal
Yes.
neurobiology is about. And some
I,
of the things are, like art and literature impact our brains.
absolutely. Like, I had a hypothesis about that there are electrical signals and fields around us, is my hypothesis. We need to interact with other electrical fields and people to live.
Well, we're social beings, and even though we have these wonderful complex brains, we need to depend on other people as part. And
Yes,
that's one of the biggest lessons my brain injuries have taught me is that I can't be an island. I'm dependent on other people for help, whether it's the people who build the roads, so that I could get to the hospital, whether it's the people who cook food in the hospital, the doctors, the volunteers, the nurses. All of those people are involved in brain injury recovery.
Absolutely.
And what there is a clinical psychologist who is also a rehab psychologist at UNM, University of New Mexico, which is where I live in New Mexico.
Yes.
And his name is Mark Pedrati. And he has developed a model to help people who've had brain injuries through psychotherapy to get their life back again. And it consists of 3 types of interventions, which are the tools psychotherapists use. We use motivational interviewing to help people stop engaging in substance abuse and also to engage in more healthful behaviors.
Absolutely. But that's what we do at my company. We help people get motivated to do healthy things instead of destructive ones.
Absolutely, because if you start using alcohol or drugs, and those are not healthy for a brain, even a healthy brain, much less an injured brain. And so recovering means moving into a healthy lifestyle, eating well, moving well, exercising, managing stress, and sleeping. And those are the things that we try to encourage people to do positively and replace drugs and alcohol around that. And, also really be aware of whether or not people, especially if they've had a stroke, I don't know the numbers about traumatic brain injury, but something like 60% of people who have strokes also develop depression. And it helps if their depression is treated. So if you're somebody who just feels like they've given up after a stroke, ask your PCP or your primary care provider for a referral to a mental health professional who can prescribe medication, to a mental health professional who can do psychotherapy, because psychotherapy is also a treatment for depression, and evaluate you to see if taking some medication would be helpful. Because you're not going to be able to recover if you're so depressed you can't get out of bed.
Exactly. I do want to say medications are a helpful tool.
They are a
They don't
wonderful tool.
fix things, but they help with getting through symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm on point if you need it.
And the other things that medications can do is like they use older antidepressants called tricyclics. They use them to treat chronic pain. And so there are ways to treat pain, because that's another thing that happens after any kind of brain injury is pain. In about half of the people who have a brain injury of any cause, people have pain. And you don't have to take opioid pain pills to manage that pain. There are apps.
And you don't have to smoke weed either.
You don't, but if you I take
It can
CBD.
help, but it just depends on the person.
Yeah, there are some people, there are components of weed that can be helpful that are not psychoactive.
CBD,
CBD is
apparently.
CBD. I use CBD along with an older antidepressant in a very low dose to manage my pain. And it doesn't affect my thinking, it doesn't affect my energy. I'm able to do my job and I'm able to participate in rehab. And I'm not suffering because we use this medication strategy. When people come to me for chronic pain, I work with them, teaching them behavioral health tools. That includes music, and there's certain frequencies of music that seem to help more than others. I encourage people to to play music if they can, and they used to, especially if they used to do music. But learning a new musical instrument, if you're capable of doing that, is also excellent for brain health.
Yes.
And doing art is also excellent. Part of using art can be processing if you've had trauma around your brain injury. But you were telling me about how your brain got injured and the auto accident and wondering if you were going to be found. And that is an incredible trauma that will stop some people in their tracks for their whole life. But a trauma therapist can help you manage those feelings and get them out so that you can move on with your life. And if that trauma therapist is trained in art therapy, often art, because it involves like drawing and using physical movement, you're able to get things out of your body and the trauma that you wouldn't just by talking.
Exactly.
And so there was a period of time after one of my brain injuries where I carried an art pad, a sketch pad, and colored pencils everywhere I went, and I just drew.
That's fantastic.
And I didn't have to be Van Gogh. I was doing it for my own enjoyment and to help me process what had happened to me.
It's like, even if it's just stick figures, draw.
Absolutely. Even if it's stick figures, kids learn to draw by drawing stick figures. And sometimes after a brain injury, you have to go back and redevelop that part of your brain.
Yes, exactly.
After college, I went to medical school, and that was in 1980. I'm actually like a very senior old lady. And so I was
accepted.
Well, age is just a number. But the reason I said that is because that was 45 years ago. And 45 years ago, when I studied neuroscience, we believed that you didn't get any extra brain cells for your whole life. What you had at birth was the number of brain cells you had. What we know now is that the brain makes new brain cells.
Exactly.
And existing brain cells can be repurposed for another job. And so that's called neuroplasticity. And that's what rehab is all about.
And that's what I love in neuroplasticity. That lights my fire. Like, I'm sure you saw my face just
Your
brighten.
face lit up.
That's the primary reason God blessed me with a neuroplasticity to be able to recover like that.
Absolutely. And then another component of the model of brain injury recovery that is in Dr. Pedotti's model is narrative therapy. And what narrative therapy is, writing stories or writing poems about your brain injury and about who you were before your brain injury and who you are afterwards. And I think that's really important for people to realize that some things are going to change after a brain injury.
Yes.
And it all depends on what part of your brain is injured. And in some ways, I was really blessed because I didn't lose my intelligence, my personality, or my education. But I almost couldn't breathe and my heart couldn't beat because that was the part of my brain that was injured. So it didn't matter if I kept those things and didn't have a functioning heart. So my stories about brain injury are about survival and what I've been able to do afterwards and use my experience to help other people. But when it was happening, it was horrifying because I understood what it meant to have a brain injury in the brainstem.
Yes, it's terrifying. So we're about out of time, unfortunately. Okay. So is there anything you would like to leave the audience with before we wrap up?
Can I ask a question and ask people to put comments if they are interested?
Yes, I would love that.
I am a psychotherapist and I primarily work with individuals. And I work with individuals are having trouble moving forward, either because of what they can't do anymore or understanding who they are and finding a new way to live their life. But there are people who have brain injuries who have a lot of support, and the injuries are not in places in the brain that are impacting parts of their personality. So I realized that I could hold workshops to talk about what happens after a brain injury and how you can heal on your own if you don't need the help of a mental health professional.
Yeah.
And I'm just interested in seeing if people would be interested in something like that.
I think that would be fantastic. Comment your thoughts down below.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much for educating us about brain injuries and telling us all your little bit about your story. I hope maybe we can have another chat sometime.
I would like that. I actually have used poetry a lot to heal from my brain injury. The brain injury that I was metabolic, I lost my ability to read and write, and I started with poetry. And I've been writing poetry since the third grade. I've published poetry, and that's how I learned to read and write again, was poetry. And that's an interesting story. So thank you very much. I've enjoyed talking to you too. And I hope people have learned something.
Thank you. I hope they have too. And real quick, down below in the comments, also comment what you learned.
That would be wonderful.
And then we can take that and do another episode perhaps on things you want to know more about. Like you learned some, but you want to know more.
And there's so much about the brain injury and about brain injury recovery. And I will research and answer questions.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Of course, we'll talk through email.
Yes.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.